All right. Very good. So this is our Bible study for December the 18th, 2022. And let's see, we've been talking about some things in Genesis 2. And I brought up this question that had been brought to me about criteria. And a graduate student had asked me, why do you use the word criteria in relation to and in the defining of the terms, and I should say in relation to and the defining of the terms fear, love, law, I should say love, testimony, law, faithfulness, custody, command, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I use the criteria. And this was my answer, because you're gonna hear this more and more and more. As the longer you're around me, you're going to hear this. You'll hear the results of this. But I said to the student, and you see, what we have in many situations is we have people who have basically memorized, or they have been so influenced by the English wording, whether the King James Version or the ESV or the NKJ or something, whatever it is, the NASB, they've been so influenced by the English wording that they've seen in those translations that they then think in terms of those words. And when someone changes that word, as I do, and I do it purposely. I've been doing this for years, trying to help people to awaken to righteousness and to begin to think in terms not of their English concept of the English words, but to think in terms of God's concept that he built into his Hebrew words and so forth. So, and it's an uphill battle for most people. I think, Rebecca, you would probably admit yourself that it was somewhat of an uphill battle in certain things for you, as we've talked about before. And I have told you and others before, just like this idea of when I first began to truly recognize that the fear of the Lord had nothing to do with afraidness. There was no dread in the fear of the Lord. There was no being scared of him in any way. Nothing that would tend to alienate one from him in that respect. And but when I first began to look at it, and I said, wait, this is not a term that's describing an afraidness in any way, to any degree, of God. This is a term that is it's just another term. It is a synonym for the criteria of his design for the relationship between him and his creation, and especially his human creations, and of his human creations to him. And it's just another term for those various points. And those various points form what we call, in the modern era, we call them criteria. You say, I don't call them that. Well, then if you don't call them that, you got a problem. You need to change your concept. Because if you keep thinking in terms of the common everyday words, as a matter of fact, Becca, would you do me a favor? Would you just look and see if the word criteria or criterion occurs in the English version?
I can do that.
And maybe check it in, check it also in the NASB, NKJ, and the ESV, if you will. And just see if the word criteria occurs, criteria or criterion occurs in things. I thought about that one day, but never did do it. But
so that was the NAS, NKJ, and ESV.
Yeah.
All right.
So we use these words, and we say, and when we have invested those words with our modern day Western culture, American especially, or Anglican, I like to say. Anglican means basically an English-speaking American. And so we invest the words with our Anglican concept, and then that's what we apply when we do it. And as we had a question in our Hebrew class on Friday evening, and there was a question in regard to a student wondering what he was supposed to have learned in this past semester, and he was a little bit taken aback because he didn't think he had learned what he should. That is, he had not learned that how he could begin to communicate in Hebrew. Well, the goal of the Hebrew class is not to learn to communicate in Hebrew. The goal of the class is to learn how to get out of the Hebrew text what God built into the Hebrew text. It's not there for you to be able to communicate with Hebrews in Israel. And I've had multiple students through the years, and they said, well, I'd like to learn Hebrew because I was thinking of going to Israel. I said, this is not the class to do that. And they come into the class, they have that presuppositional basis of this is what it means to learn biblical Hebrew. And I said, that's not the right presupposition. Your presupposition is you need to have the purpose that you want to perceive what God built into the words as he gave them. And these people, but won't that help me learn? I said, yes, it will help you, but that's not what I'm going to teach you. I'm going to give you a foundation so that you can take these criteria and you can use them to understand the criteria that God built into his word. And it's amazing to me how many people have been they're just, I don't know. Anyway, so did you find anything, Becca?
I did not.
What do you mean? You didn't find anything?
I did not. The KJV, NAS, NKJV, and ESV, none of them have either the word criterion or criteria. As a matter of fact, as soon as I hit the R, CRITER, the word went red in all versions.
Wow. I'm sure that would be in the Christian Standard Bible and and about all the others. Now that's kind of amazing. But we got good words like we got law, testimony, commandment, fear, love, hate, good, evil. We got all of that. I mean, even love. If fear is not afraidness, then love is not love, not according to the human definition. But this is what I wrote back to the student. I used the term criteria with respect to each of these in an attempt to correct the view which most people have when they think of law, testimony, commandment, fear, love, hate, good, evil, faithfulness, etc. Each of these terms refers to the design of God, but each also represents that design from a slightly different perspective. When people, even believers, think of God's will, oh, I want to do God's will. I just want to do God's will, God's will. They have in mind some kind of generalized, nebulous, overall concept, and they do not think of God's will as being comprised of a series of specific points. And I'm going to put that A in there. Somebody left it out, my secretary. Specific statements, specific criteria that all apply individually and all work together perfectly integrally to form his overall will. See, it's like there's this will of God and there's this blasé thing, this ethereal concept. It has no finite existence. It just kind of, I just want to do God's will. And they don't have a clue. And these are men who are going out and preaching and teaching to other people and trying to teach about the will of God, and they don't even know that God's will is not some ethereal concept. It's very specific. It has specific points, specific statements, specific criteria that all apply individually and all work together perfectly, integrally to form his overall will. There's no lack in it, believe me. But when people do not think of God's will in terms of its many specific individual points, each of which defines a necessary aspect of conformity to his design, then they lose sight of those specific points. And they think of themselves as in the will of God, though all the while they are violating one after another of the specific individual criteria of his design. You see, we had guys, Bible college, at Tennessee Temple, at Ambassador, at Tabernacle. You had these people, and they wanted to do God's will. They were going to do God's will. Oh, and God's will. They were going to be pastors or missionaries or evangelists or something, and they were going to be in the will of God doing that job. But then in their day-to-day life, they were destroying people. They're destroying their family, destroying their own lives, because they had this idea, well, I'm in the will of God, and therefore I'm in this special place of God. And I'm saying, no, you're not. No, you are not. And it's not a legalistic concept. People say, well, you put too much stress on the individual points of God's will. No, I don't. I only put on there what God is putting on it. He created us as incremental beings. Incremental. That is, we are beings who do not have this blasé, broad concept of God's will, God's design, God's law, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have this big blob of God's law, and we understand every aspect of it and how it applies. We aren't that way. God has to give it to us. And we've heard the terminology: precept upon precept, line upon line, point upon point, increment upon increment, piece by piece, bit by bit. And we take those, and then what we are supposed to do with all of these things, we take them and then we put them together. In a sense, what we do is we weave this beautiful tapestry of the design of God. And you'd be better to do the design of God than the will of God when you use will according to its modern concept. So you do this beautiful tapestry of the design of God, which has many, many threads, and they go through all kinds of different ways and a little bit differently in every life, but they all weave a beautiful picture. And you don't lose sight of the individual threads, but and when you see all the threads together in their proper fashion, they make a beautiful tapestry of something. But what happens is we have people that say, well, I'm going to do the will of God, and they think I'm going to do this tapestry of God, but I can just do it the way I think it should be done. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. The God who is does not allow you or me or and even all fundamental, temperamental, idiot Baptist. Oh, did I say that? I said that again, didn't I, Rebecca? I got to quit saying that. Even though, see, I said idiot. Now, some of you are sitting there, and you yourself have not yet learned what the term idiot actually means when I use it. Because you see, I use it not by its modern day Western culture, 21st century American concept or its Anglican concept. I use it as it was used by God in his Greek text. And the word idiot, idiotes, is from the word idios. And idios relates to one's self, a focus on an individual. That's a self-focus, if you will. So when I use it and say someone is an idiot, that means that person is focused on self, thinking that he is, and this is, when I use it this way, he's thinking that he knows the design of God, but he knows it apart from intensive analytical study of what God's revealed. Now that's an idiot. That's somebody who thinks himself to possess himself individually, to possess the authority to determine what God said without even studying what God said. They say, well, I've read my Bible 27 times this year. I don't care if you read it 27,000 times this year. You got to know what it means. You don't go by what the meanings that connote in your mind. You go by the meanings that God intended to communicate. And that's a problem in independent Baptist circles. But and I'm saying that about independent Baptists, But I'm going to tell you, evangelicals, Presbyterians, etc., they've all gone the same direction. The Southern Baptists, Conservative Baptists, they've all gone the same direction. It's the tendency of humanity to go away from the intensive analytical study of the scriptures and to their own definitions of good and evil. We don't want God's design, because if we want God's design will tell us all too often that we are not right. So when people do not think of God's will in terms of its many specific individual points, and you have to think, did God just say, okay, Adam and Eve, now that you got this authority, y'all just go out there and operate the creation? No, I'm not going to tell you how to do it. You go figure it out for yourself. You know what? That's pure stupidity. That is misrepresentation of God. I mean, if he built them to do certain functions in the creation, then he imparted to them and he built into them all that they would need to perform every function as he designed it to be done. They would function and interact with everything in the creation accurately, properly. But somehow we get this idea, well, God blessed them. Well, what did it mean to bless them? I can tell you one aspect of his blessing. He expressed to them what his will, his design was for all that they were to do. And while they walked within the criteria of that design, they could not escape being blessed, because the Creator himself was able to walk with them, to interact with them in a totally unalienated manner. Nothing between, as the song says, my soul and the Savior. That's what he could do. That is his design. And we have these, when we're preaching and teaching these other concepts, then we don't know God accurately. And there are a lot of preachers out there that don't know God, period. Now, I'm not saying they're not saved. That's a different concept. They might be saved, but there's a difference in knowing God and having been saved by him, and then continuing to seek after you have been saved so that you know him accurately, so you can represent him accurately. So people lose sight of the specific point, and they think themselves as in the will of God, though all the while they are violating one after another of the specific individual criteria of his design. And you better go read 1 Timothy 1 and find out what that means there when Paul said to Timothy, said they desire, oh yeah, they wanted to be law teachers. That's what the word says, nomodidaskaloi. They wanted to be law teachers. They wanted to be instructors in the criteria of God's design, but they were not understanding the things they were saying. They didn't even understand the nature of the things they were saying, and they did not perceive what they were confirming in the minds of believers when they said things. Just like I've said so many times, we have men all the time that stand up in front of a congregation on Sunday morning and they'll say, oh, it's so good to be in the house of God. What? Is the church building, as we call it, is this physical structure, is that the house of God? Is this where God dwells, and then he doesn't dwell outside the door or up the street or across town or in your home? How dumb can you get? And the one about, well, we all just deserve hell. No, you might deserve hell. I don't deserve hell anymore. Before I accepted Christ, I deserved hell. I deserved the lake of fire because I was living in a state of rejecting the revelation of God and his only means of reconciliation. And as long as I rejected, then this system God had built said, if you reject, then you will be alienated. And if you're rejecting when you die, you will be permanently alienated. Huh, you know, but when I accepted Christ, the alienation was gone. I no longer deserve hell. I no longer deserve the lake of fire. And why don't the men who stand in our pulpits express these things accurately? And the reason is because they're not seeking to do it accurately. They have not aimed at hitting the target. You know what, Becca, I'm gonna go over to that real quick. And I think we went to it once before, didn't we? Do you recall?
Uh, I don't think we did actually.
You say you think we did?
I do not think we did.
Oh, we didn't do that here?
No, I don't think so.
I've only done it about 500 times in my life, so I can't remember all the points and times when I've done it. But let's see, can I find that? I may be able to find that. That would be somewhere over in, let's see, it's not in theology. That would be in the New Testament. And that should be somewhere in the Pauline epistles. And I do not say Pauline epistles, I say Pauline epistles, and etc. I don't pronounce the I-N-E as ein, I pronounce it een. And so if good way, you can either agree with me or disagree with me. I really don't care. But here's First Timothy. And let's see, oh boy, there are a lot of little pieces of this, weren't there? First Timothy 1 through 11. Let's see what I have in layouts. Here we are. And unto Timothy, my own son in faith, he said grace, mercy, peace. He did not say grace, mercy, and peace. He said grace, mercy, peace. And so now you think about it. By the way, the word and is italicized. He used no connecting conjunction between grace, mercy, peace. That's a significant construction. And by the way, if you're listening to a preacher or teacher and he says, well, this is just a standard greeting of a letter in the New Testament era. No, it is not. Either it is the design of the Holy Spirit of God and it expresses accurately what Paul was wishing to exist to Timothy, his own son in the faith, or it's not. And that's what it says. So you got people who say, well, that's a normal opening of a letter. No, it's not. The person who is saying that does not know the nature of the scriptures accurately. And you better be careful of listening to that kind of a preacher. You better be careful. They're all over the place. And they say these things that ungodly men have said and led them to say in seminaries and things. I was taught that way by at least one. And I have had to learn that was not true. And the man had a PhD from Grace Theological Seminary, but he didn't know the scriptures accurately. Degrees don't amount to a hill of beans. But look what he said. He said, as I besought thee to abide still at Ephesus, when I went into Macedonia, you say Macedonia, that's Macedonia, Greek, Macedonia. So that thou mightest charge some, you're going to lay these words alongside these people, so it goes along with them, and it should have an influence upon them, that thou mightest charge that they teach no other doctrine. They're not to teach differently. They're not to give heed to fables and endless genealogies. Endless genealogies are not the genealogies of Scripture. These are genealogies that are, if you look at the words endless and genea, the first part here, that's the word for beginnings, origins, where we get Genesis from. And the logis, it's the word for, it's related to logia or logos or lego, to say that which is expressed. So endless genealogies would be endless. That means they have no bounds. They're unbounded expressions of beginnings. That's all. That's what all of these other ideas of the beginnings of that science says, big bangs and stuff like that, they don't have any idea. So they have these these fables, made up things, and they have these unbounded expressions of origins. And they had them in the New Testament era just like we have them now. The only thing is, people just reword them to make them more acceptable to the ignorant. And you say, ignorant? Why do you call people ignorant? Because it's what it means. Ignorant means people do not know. And by the way, you find that people who do not know tend, when they have adopted an idea about something, they are less receptive to instruction than people who have begun to come out of their ignorance by listening to instruction. Ignorant people become crystallized in their ignorance, and they do not want to change, because to do so, they must confess that they have been wrong. And that is not something that humans like to do, including yours truly. But so these fables and endless genealogies, which they just bring up questions and all this stuff. Well, what about this? Or where did that? Or how? And it's not godly edifying. But he said the end of the commandment, and this is the issue. The end of the commandment is charity, that is love, out of a pure heart, a good conscience, faith unfeigned. By the way, those are 3 synonyms. You cannot have one without having the other 2. If you think you have 1 or 2 and you don't have the third, then you are a liar to yourself. You're convincing yourself of something that is not true. You cannot have one without the other 2, anyone without the other 2. That's 3 ways of looking at the nature of what's going on inside a person. And then you look, he says, so this is the end of the commandment is love, and it's out of a pure heart, a good conscience, a faith unfeigned. That's an unhypocritical faith, a good way, a proper design for looking at things. Becca, were you the one that was it you and I who were talking about the word for conscience, a good conscience?
We were, yes, sir.
And what was it you said that how you were explaining a good conscience?
Oh, yes. So I was having a conversation with
Okay.
another individual, and
Be right
that
back.
person, and so that person was she's Japanese, and she was reading her Japanese translation of the scriptures, and she had come to let me see, let me just go ahead and make sure that I get this one right. So it's in Hebrews, and so yes, so Hebrews 9:14, this idea that we need to purge our conscience, to cleanse our conscience. Well, the Japanese word for conscience literally would translate to good thinking. So her question was, how is it that we can cleanse our good thinking? Because good thinking, by definition, would already be clean. And so I took her back to the Greek text, where the Greek word for conscience is the word sunedesis, which is a composite of 2 parts, basically edo, the idea of to see, and then soon, which is the preposition with, together with. So literally a conscience then is a seeing together with. That is that with which we perceive things, and then begin to correlate everything else to one another in order to come to a conclusion. So thus, really, it's referring to a way of thinking. And so thus, our way of thinking can be either good, that is in conformity with the design of God, or it can be evil, that is not in conformity with the design of God. And so thus, as we begin, what we need to do, we need to change our thinking so that it is then in accordance and conformity with the design of God, and in so doing, we are cleansing our conscience. We are cleansing our seeing together with.
Hmm. Okay. So if you don't have a good conscience, can you have a clean heart? No. Can you have a faith unfeigned and unhypocritical faith? A
Mhm.
firmness, unhypocritical firmness? You think about it. We have people who run around all the time, and they would claim to have, oh, I'm not a hypocrite. I have an unhypocritical faith, but they don't have a good seeing together of the facts and correlation of the facts of with the facts of God's design. And they don't have the clean heart, that's the pureness of heart and the pureness of motive and everything. They don't have it. And they think they've got a faith unfeigned. Not so. Not so. Absolutely. But look at why when he says, these, the end of the commandment, this is what the goal, the end, the telos of the commandment is. It's a pure heart, a good conscience, and faith unfeigned. And then he says, from which these three things, he says, from which some, and having swerved, have turned aside unto vain jangling, worthless words, basically worthless expressions. That's another one of those things we can see down there in the Greek text. But notice, they were desiring to be teachers of the law. They were actually desiring this. But on the other side, the alternative is, but they weren't understanding. They wanted to be teachers of the law, but they didn't understand what they were saying. They don't even know what they're affirming in the minds of people when they say things. And you say, well, how could that be if they were desiring to be teachers of the law? Look up here. He says, from which some, they had turned aside unto vain jangling, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor whereof they affirm. Why did they do that? Do you see this right here? Two little words in the English text, having swerved. Having swerved. Having swerved. Well, why did they swerve? Why didn't they just keep going straight? That's not what the word means. That's not what the word means. And people say, well, you don't teach law, you put people back under the law and all that. You need to read verse 8, because we know that the law is good. That is, the law is the design of God. So let's go down, see what this having swerved is. What does it mean? This is why people, this is, they couldn't hit the target because they didn't aim at the target. And here's the, see if I can get this. Come on up here. Give me my bar. And let's move over to here. And here's the actual meaning of that. So the completion of the proclamation alongside, that is when you lay something alongside the commandment, exists love. The completion exists love. That is not an emotional feeling, but the criteria of God's design for the relationship between two entities of whatever their nature. Very, very, very. Love is very similar to chesed. And then he said, so it exists love, and that's love would come out of a clean heart, a good seeing together of things, that is in your mind, you're seeing these things in your mind accurately, and an unhypocritical firmness. And then he said, from which things some, and notice, it's not having swerved. It is, they are not having aimed. And when you go back over to the Greek text, we can see it here just a moment. What you see here, here's the word right here. This is hon tenez, from which some astakesantes. You say, well, what in the world does that mean? Well, thought you'd never ask. And they had turned out into mataiologion, that is worthless expressions. Worthless expressions. Would there be Baptist preachers that stand up and they are giving worthless expressions? Yes. Yes, they're doing it all the time because they're not paying attention. They don't aim at what they should be aiming at. And here's that willing, thelantes, enai, nama didaskaloi. Nama is the word for law, and didaskaloi is teachers. So they're designed to be law teachers, teachers of the design of Christ, teachers of the design of God, but they are me nauntes. They are not even perceiving, understanding, not even the things which they are saying. In other words, they're saying things. And while they're saying them, they're not even understanding the things they're saying. And so they say these things. I mean, just like we have people that say, well, you know, I want you all to know that I'm just so proud to be your pastor, or I'm so proud of you all. I was talking to somebody the other day in the community, and I started to hand out something from our church. And the person said, oh, I have one of those already. One of the people of your church gave it to you. And that made me just so proud that you were a part of my church and that I was your pastor. Maybe whatever happened to doing word studies, whatever happened to evaluating whether or not pride is something that is to be practiced in the design of God, or it's something to be avoided totally. Look at all the references to the word. Look up the Hebrew and the Greek words for that, and you're going to find there's no positive expression of pride. You say, well, there are two places where it's a little different. It's not necessarily bad. Okay, you have 2 out of about of hundreds, 100 places, and all of the others are totally negative. It's something to be avoided, but we pick out just like, listen, just like when we say, well, you know, Paul said to Timothy, take a little wine for your stomach, and therefore, you see, I can take a little wine. I found an excuse in the scriptures for me to do what I want to do. And that's the same thing that's happening in these other places. I find something in the scriptures that allows me to decide what I want to do. That is, you want to express it accurately, go ahead and say it accurately, that this allows me to determine good and evil for myself. That's what it's saying. And why did this happen? Why did these men, why are their expressions worthless? Why is it that they're saying these things? They wanted to be teachers of the design, but how can it be that these men who wanted to be good things turned out to the point where they don't even understand what they're saying? They don't even recognize what they're actually confirming in the minds of people by the things they say. How can that be? Well, here's the word. There's the word, astakesantes. You say, what in the world does astakesantes mean? Hold on. I don't like, the only thing I don't like about modern computers, they think they're smarter than you are. And I don't, and that is not true. They just work like a machine. They're not smarter. Sometimes they're just totally wrong. That's why I don't like a lot of the things they do. I'm going to skip that. Skip down here. Here, this verse 6. The relative clause, you say, oh no, we're getting into grammar again. If you have that idea, your heart is not right with God. I'll say it that very definitely. If you think it is that you don't need to understand grammar when you're dealing with the text of scripture, your heart is not right with God, because God gave his words. He gave his revelation in grammatical structures. and the grammatical structures are significant according to his design. And if you think they're not important, and if you have a pastor or preacher who thinks they're not important, then you might need to say something to him about it, and you might need to find another place to go if he's too adamant that, well, it doesn't matter. The relative clause hon, that was from which, describes the reason why some were actually willing, they were willing to be teachers of God's design, but they had turned out of God's way by their own thinking to vain jangling, that is, to worthless expressions. Instead of focusing on developing the inward aspects of godliness, clean heart, good conscience, unhypocritical firmness, they had obviously busied themselves with learning the external aspects which seemed to indicate godliness to others. It's called Phariseeism. Paul used the aorist participle. What in the world is an aorist participle? Well, let me explain to you. He used the aorist participle, Notice the A has the two dots above it. That means it's pronounced as the A in father, and then sto, the O is short. The HK has the bar under it, meaning it's pronounced like it's an HK together, not two separate letters. And the A, the epsilon, the E with the accent is like an A sound. So we have ostakesantes. It's not ostakesantes, it's ostakesantes. And so now, notice, it is from the verb stokeo. The verb stokeo means to aim. The alpha on the front, that has an alpha privative on the front of it to indicate the basic reason, bracketing this participle between the subject and verb of the relative clause. So it's in between. The literal translation, not having aimed, gives a perfect expression of why these who were willing to be teachers of truth had become willing teachers of wrong. They had never properly aimed at knowing God as he had revealed himself. It was not that they had not truly wanted to be proper teachers and preachers, but that they had not truly wanted to learn of God as he had revealed himself. Their will in the matter was to learn what they, for whatever reasons, thought was sufficient for them to serve God as they intended. God's actual will in the matter of their learning and development was of no consequence. They knew better than he did what they needed. Thus, they justified themselves in believing and living and representing God and his design, as though whatever they knew, however they had learned it, and however they applied it, was all true. And certainly it was enough for them in their ministry, and that's it. It was their ministry, not his. They satisfied themselves that nearby targets, which everyone could see, were all that was required. They just had all these targets, and they're nice and close. Oh, I can shoot at that target. I can shoot at that one. Oh, yeah, I can hit all of these. But that's never the design of God. They satisfied themselves that nearby targets, which everyone could see, were all that was required. All you got, just believe the gospel. That's all you got to do, just believe the gospel. Never realizing that the Creator never intended such a perspective for any believer. His design had always been that each one develop the ability to properly hit targets of knowledge and understanding at increasingly greater distances, even if others around them could not perceive the necessity of developing such marksmanship. And as we talked about before, that's why there have been people that said, Brother Sheets, you just know too much. You've just learned too much. And the people that said the people that said that kind of thing, they were not lost people. They're believers, ignorant believers. You say, were they not saved? No, I believe they're saved. I believe they're seeking to live godly. but their knowledge and understanding of God and his design is very, very superficial. It's rooted, well, we go to church and that's it. And we're there and we sit and whatever the preacher says, we listen to it. And they don't have any real perception of what God would have them to know. So the relative clause that we're talking about here also describes the result of their not having aimed, their turning aside. You see, it was not that they had swerved. It's that they were not having aimed. They did not aim. They were not swerving. They hadn't aimed. And if you don't aim, you can't hit the target. Their lack of understanding from never having truly aimed at developing a full and accurate knowledge of God had left them without the ability to recognize the obvious error of the things they were saying, and also without the perception needed to discern the many less obvious, but no less erroneous, implications both of their own teachings and the teachings of others. These who had never truly aimed, or who had discontinued aiming, but who had been entrusted to know God accurately, preached and taught him and his design erroneously, conducting themselves as though their knowledge was sufficient, or as though their own personal understanding of God and his design was accurate and without need of correction, and claiming themselves to be men of God. Individuals of this sort have been misleading the sheep of the master's flock since the beginnings of humankind, and they continue to do so in the present. And that's where we are, folks. That's where we are. Now, I wanted to share a couple of other little things with you here. We had talked about at different times the nature of Adam's wording. And let me go over here to this first. And the way Adam worded his text in Genesis 2 when he was describing the condition in the garden. Now, Adam's statement regarding the completion of the creation, that's given in 1 through 3. Okay, we've already been down through this at some point in time. We're not going to go right back through it again. Then he gave the description of the conditions existing in the creation immediately after it was created. And that is an important thing that you recognize. He was not coming up with some kind of new thing. He was telling about the conditions that were extant at that time after the creation had been completed and immediately after it. And you keep in mind, he saw it. He experienced it because he was there on day 6. So, and then he gives all of these other things about these things that were existing in the earth, before it was existing in the earth, how they come to be in the earth before it was in the earth. Well, they were put there by God. And anyway, so then he gives his description of his own creation as revealed to him by God, obviously so, no question. But Adam was able to communicate without alienation. They could communicate with God, and God could communicate these things to him. But then look at this, about Adam's description of the garden and the rivers which watered it. And we'd say, and I don't even remember what the English text says here, but that's inconsequential now. Then Yahweh Elohim caused growing from the ground the entirety of trees existing, pleasant to sight and good to food. And the tree of life. And notice, you have to supply a verb here. And the tree of life, and you could say, was in the midst of the garden. From our perspective, the tree of life was, you see, that's looking back to past tense, as if it were a continuing action in the past. The tree of life was existing in the midst of the garden. And the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, understood, was existing in the midst of the garden, or exist. And a river was existing or was going out from Eden to cause the drinking of the garden. And from there, it was separating, and it was existing 4 heads. And the name of the one was Pishon, and then, and we can talk about that a little more in a minute. And then we had Gihon and the Chereko, and then Parath. And then we have this about God taking Adam, causing him to rest in the garden. Then he instructed him regarding what he was to eat from and not. And we've seen that already before, been there to that passage. And then he has man. And we're going to talk more about the actual creation of the woman here in just a few minutes. But what I wanted to do here is I wanted you to think about this. And I have a PowerPoint here that may help us a little bit. And it's not completed. As with everything I do not ever intend to complete anything. And so I never have incomplete documents. I have documents that will never be completed because I do not have an infinite mind like the mind of the God who gave the revelation. But let's look at just a couple of things about the text of Genesis 2. And this has got enough to get our mind thinking. But the text of Genesis 2, this is Adam's eyewitness account. The actual Hebrew wording of Genesis 2 indicates the record to be an eyewitness account. The specific verb forms, while consecutives, and place names all combine to indicate that Adam, the first human, was the original author. Now, I'm not saying that he wrote this before the fall or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that he was in the garden before the fall. And then we need to think about what existed after that. So, a crucial fact, the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life continued to exist until the flood. The Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life continued from the time of their creation until the flood, when they would have been destroyed, leaving Noah and his descendants with only memories of their existence. The Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life were still in existence. Listen, they were still in existence during the entire life of Adam, all 930 years. There is absolutely no indication that after God expelled Adam and Eve from the garden and then placed there the Keruvim to guard the way to the Tree of Life so they couldn't go back to it, there is absolutely no indication of that garden ever having been, or let's say, ceasing to exist until the flood would have destroyed it. That's 1,652 years into history. And I know some of you say, oh, no, it was 1654. Well, you calculate it the way you want with your whole years. I calculate by the part year of as far as ages in the Middle Eastern and the African perspective, and that makes 1652. And so that's another matter. It's in the timeline. The note is there, and you can evaluate it if you see fit. But the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life were still in existence during the entire life of Adam, all 930 years. Considering God's purpose for Adam's record, it would not make sense for Adam to write of the garden and its characteristics in the past tense. Why would you? It'd be like me saying, my wife is sitting over here beside me right now. Barbara sits in the chair beside me. And instead of saying Barbara is sitting in the chair beside me, I'd say, Barbara sat in the chair beside me. When I'm talking about her being there right now at this moment. When Adam wrote of the garden and its characteristics, he would not have written in the past tense. They were still there. It was still there. The garden still existed, and especially while the Keruvim, think about this, those angels, those cherubs, were still there guarding the entrance to the way to the tree of life. They were still there. There's nothing to indicate that they got tired and went home. The garden remained. The characteristics of the garden remained. The rivers of the garden remained. And it remained all the way up until the time of the flood. And it would make no sense for Adam to say, well, back in antiquity, when I used to be in the garden, then these things were there. Not what he was saying. It was still there. And anybody who cared to know could walk right up to the entrance, right to where the cherubs were, and see the cherubs, that they were still there guarding the entrance to the way to the tree of life. And it would have made no sense to say, well, they used to be there, because they still are. The Garden of Eden and the tree of life. That's the same slide. I'm modifying that slide shortly. So Adam used wow conjunctives in his description of the garden and its characteristics. An examination of the wow consecutives and the wow conjunctives used to introduce the independent clauses, which often begin verses, reveals an interesting pattern. In this presentation, the terms imperfect consecutive and perfect consecutive will be used to refer to wow consecutives on imperfect and perfect verbs, respectively. But in Genesis 1, Adam used the imperfect consecutives almost continuously, 50 times in 31 verses. That's roughly 1.6 times per verse on the average. And there were none in the first two verses. So that's a good 1.6. So actually it'd be 50 times in 29 verses. And he did this to indicate progression and sequence in the activities of the Creator. In Genesis 2, Adam used imperfect consecutives only 26 times in the 25 verses. So in nearly the same number of verses, he used the imperfect consecutives only about half the number of times to indicate progression and sequence in the activities of the Creator and others. Now, in Genesis 2, Adam referred to rivers by name. There's the Pishon, the Gihon, Hiddekel, and Prat rivers, which were eventually destroyed by the flood. He also referred to places by name: Havilah, Cush, Ashur, even Eden, places which were eventually destroyed by the flood. All of these rivers and places were destroyed by the flood, but their existence and their names remained in the memories of Noah and his family in the post-flood world. Now, these rivers existed all through the life of Adam, and the places, as humans spread upon the great landmass of dry land, continued to exist during his life. So all the rivers, the places, they're there. It wasn't that they used to be, they still are. Thus, for him to write as though their existence was something of the past would have been nonsense. But Adam was wise. He would not have used verb forms. Oh, just a moment. I'm going to take that as off there. He would not have used verb forms which were past tense. He would use verb forms which were present tense. And this is exactly what he did. You say, how can you say that? Well, let's look. Let's consider the text. This is what occurs in 2:10. And a river going out from Eden to cause watering the garden. And from there it separates and it exists to four heads. So what would we do? Well, if he was speaking in this way, let's say, you'd have to supply the verb exist, and a river exists going out from Eden. See, it wasn't that the river used to go out from Eden. The river's still going out from Eden, going out from Eden, and it's causing the watering of the garden. And from there, it separates, or it is separating. But basically, and it's an incomplete action there. And it exists to four heads. See, these were all things that were still in existence when Adam is writing chapter 2. And then he says, in the name of the one, Pishon, it, this one surrounding the entirety of the land of the Havilah, which there got the gold, and the gold of that land good. There the bdellium, and the stone of the onyx. And you say, wait a minute, there are no verbs in there. You're right, there are no verbs, unless you put them in. You supply the being verbs. And the being verbs, see, the name of the one, he's talking about rivers that are existing. It'd be like saying, well, there used to be a river in the middle of the United States that went from the north to the south, and it was the Mississippi. No, it still is the Mississippi. It is still there. Might be drying up, but it's still there. You see, it wouldn't make sense to say it in those days it existed, the Mississippi. No, that if we wanted to put it into the past, we would. But if Adam's writing of it, and he's talking about, he didn't say, back when I was in the garden, he's saying the name of the one, Pishon. Ah, the name of the one, that's the one that exists right now. It exists, the one surrounding the entirety of the land of the Havilah, which there exists, the gold. You see, it's still there. When Adam's writing, it's still there. And the gold of that land exists good. There exists the bdellium, dolah in Hebrew, and the stone of the onyx. And you think, it makes sense. These would be present tense. When he goes to 2:13 and 14, he's telling about more rivers that actually are existing. And the name of the second river, Gihon, it, the one surrounding the entirety of the land of Cush. And the name of the third river, Hickory, it, the one going from the east of Asher. And the fourth river, it, Perath. And when you put in the verbs, then you'd see, get down there, the name of the second river, exist, Gihon. It exists, the one surrounding the entirety of the land of Cush. And the name of the third river, exist, Hiddekel. It exists, the one going the east of Asher. And the fourth river, it exists, Perath. And so you see, these things, it would not make sense for Adam to be speaking in past tense of something that is still extant and apparently visible in some way or discernible in some way to other people, to say this used to exist, and they go and they say, no, Adam, it still does. It's right there. It'd be like saying, there were two cherubim. There were two cherubim, and they were with flaming swords, and they guarded the way to the tree of life so nobody could get there. And yet you could walk right up. You could still walk up to it. Adam and Eve could walk up to it. Their children and descendants could walk up to it. And the cherubim are still there. There's no indication that the cherubim ever went home. It was still existing. And this is not a story that was passed down and then Moses wrote it some 2,700 years after creation. It's the story. It was a record of the man Adam, that part of the record that he began. And let's see, you know what? I wonder. I'm not going to go there now. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to behave myself. I was thinking, Rebecca, reading some of that thing that I wrote last night that I sent to you. But
yes.
I think we'll leave that alone for now. And let's go over, let's look at the word Sabbath. Sabbath, Shabbath. And I don't think we touched on this word, but we didn't deal with the paper, and I can send it out. But dealing with this Saturday or Sunday, what day is the Sabbath? It's not a criterion of righteousness in God's sight. The Creator, by his own distinctive action, initiated the Sabbath after he had finished all that exists in 6 literal days. The word there is a word for complete or finish. Thus, on the 7th day, he ceased, stopped, Shabbath, or the verb is Shabbat here. So they say Sabbath, Shab. The Jews say Shabbat, and that is the origin. This word is the origin of that word. So he ceased, stopped his creative activities, not because he was tired or needed to rest or to in any way regain strength to continue, but because the creation existed in the entirety of his design. It was done. Indeed, the Hebrew word, which refers to resting after having engaged in some kind of expenditure of energy, is a totally different word, nuach. The word which is the root of the name Noah, Genesis 5:29. The God who exists and in whom the entirety of creation exists had not expended energy outside himself. He had given himself to the activity of creating. At the end of the 6th day, nothing more was to be brought into existence. But he wasn't expending energy out there and says, oh boy, I got to go get something to eat and I got to get some rest so I can be able to finish this or do something else. Many who read the English text of Scripture have misunderstood the nature of God's rest on the 7th day, thinking that he actually needed to rest as do his human creatures. Thus the question arises, why then did the Creator cease from activities on that 7th day? The answer is clear. Since every action of the Creator is a perfect expression of his person and nature and is an exact representation of his design, he ceased his activities specifically to provide humans with a time, the last day of every 7 days, to turn their thoughts away from the cares and activities associated with living on earth. Excuse me. The 7th day was to free their minds to consider the God who had brought them into existence and to consider the criteria of his perfect design and the equally perfect results of which occurred, when those criteria, were applied. Humans would need a regular time of both mental and physical refreshment, and he established his design for the frequency of that refreshment by finishing this creation in 6 days and ceasing on the 7th. Some in the present day have posited that the Sabbath must be on Saturday, the actual 7th day, and not on Sunday, the first day of the week. Most, however, who practice a Saturday Sabbath and claim to be believers in Christ do not practice a heart and internal desire that is truly seeking God and his design. Rather, they observe a Saturday Sabbath as an external criterion, a ritual, as though fulfilling the ritual makes them in some way more acceptable or righteous in the eyes of God. Certainly, many believers who practice a Sunday Sabbath do not do so out of a pure heart, seeking to walk with him in his way. They, too, have made Sunday worship an external criterion of righteousness. Regardless of their protest to the contrary, those who practice either day without applying their heart to know and understand him have become like the Pharisees and Galatians. They focus on obeying him, but they have lost sight, if they ever knew, of walking so close with him that the individual criteria of his design fade in the light of simply seeking his pleasure. That's why you can walk in the Spirit and you won't fulfill the desires of the flesh. Some wonder whether or not modern humans actually know which day is the actual 7th day as God established it in the beginning. The Creator preserved Adam and other godly individuals. men who undoubtedly possessed brilliant minds. And with those men, he preserved the knowledge of the actual seventh day. I don't have any doubt of that. And that knowledge was passed through the generations and through multiple people groups. Certainly, the believers of the New Testament era knew which day was the seventh, just as they knew that Christ arose on the first day of the week. And that information has passed through the centuries to the present. While it is true that some confusion may have occurred in the transmission and change of calendars, the actual seventh day is likely the seventh day as presently accounted. For those who have established that the only acceptable day of worship is Saturday, or if that day be Sunday, they have departed from the faith, not recognizing that God established his Sabbath on the day after he created humans. And as he said, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. As with so many good things which God has provided and established, men have turned them into Pharisaical standards, indications of righteousness, indications not to God who looks on the heart, but to other humans, so each can discern the righteousness of others, a practice in total contradiction to the person and nature of the God who exists. Through the millennia of time, many have desired to observe the Sabbath or even a Sabbath, but the conditions of life precluded their doing so. Sabbath keeping was never intended by God to indicate righteousness. It was for humans to have at least one day in 7 to be set apart, to cease from the activities of life, for seeking him as he has revealed himself. Of course, such seeking should be continual, but life gets in the way, quote unquote. And many authorities exist who hate God. Going to take that S off of there. And thus the day is not the issue, but the heart is. As he said, you will seek me and you will find me when you search for me with all your heart, and I will be found of you. And I did not put the reference there, but that's Jeremiah 29, 13, and 14. And we're beyond our time. So any questions, thoughts, or anything? We talked about the criteria. We may touch on cursing and blessing a little bit. We discussed, did we not in here discuss the reason for, Eve's reason for adding words to God's prohibition? Didn't we do that?
We did, yes, sir.
So, and but we did not do externalization of worship. Okay. Externalization of prayer. Oh, externalization. We would never do that unless it was today or tomorrow. Okay. Oh, I also do have a little thing I'll send out to you. This is just a quickie thing here that I did answer a question. Someone asked about the difference between the words make, because Adam and other scripture writers used at least 3 different words describing God's creation of his first human. In Genesis 1:26 says he made man. That is the verb asa. And 1:27 says he created man. That's bara. In Genesis 2:7 says he formed man. That's yatzar. Each word views the origin of humans from a different perspective. Make is the most general Hebrew word for making or doing. Thus, it indicates simply that God did the action of making the human. That's all it means. He made humans. Create is the Hebrew word for bringing something into existence which did not previously exist. Thus, when God made the human, he brought into existence something, the human, which had never before existed. The materials from which he made the human existed before he brought them into existence in Genesis 1. Then form is the Hebrew word for shaping or forming something that is, for forming something into a specific shape. Thus, when God made the human, he formed the human in a very specific way to function, or in very specific ways, to function and interact in specific ways. God moved Adam and his holy men to use these different words to focus on humans from these differing perspectives. In so doing, he revealed the origin from all perspectives of all humanity in himself. He is the one who made the first two humans, and in doing so, he brought into existence something which did not exist previously, and he formed them in very specific ways to function and interact with all the creation in very specific ways. Clearly, the Creator perfectly constructed every aspect of his human creations. So we are made, created, and formed